Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning, Bitcoiners. Sun is up, sort of, kind of cloudy, but Bitcoin's running. Adjust my hat so it doesn't look so crooked. We can have a coffee. We're good. Ready to go. We could talk about all the fun stuff. This show is really about relationships, and we're going to help someone who's in an abusive relationship. David Pakman is his name. And David Pakman, if you don't know who he is a YouTuber. He's got a Twitch show, and recently he's been banned from TikTok. So he was complaining yesterday. He says, "Hi, TikTok support. Our account with more than 200,000 followers was permanently suspended due to content misidentified as promoting election and COVID lies, even though we were debunking those lies. Please help." So David Pakman is a progressive. I often used him as an example of someone who was experiencing similar sort of shadow banning effects previous to the 2020 election. So he would often complain, "I'm losing followers." Some similar things you hear from right-wing people. So this is another case where it's happening to him, just like he said it did, right? So what I'm saying here is David Pakman, I think, is a credible source in saying that he's been censored and it's happened to him before. So, and I would often bring him up as an example of how it's not only on one side, right? It's not just right-wing people getting censored. There's also some progressives getting censored. But I always was a little bit confused because he made such a point, and he was the only one that I heard on the progressive spectrum, end of the spectrum, saying they were getting censored. So it surprised me when he actually uncovered why he was getting censored. And what we have here is a little bit of an indication. He says, "We have been permanently suspended from TikTok, permanently suspended, for our content misidentified as promoting COVID and election lies, thanks to mass reporting by MAGA people. In fact, our videos debunked those lies. Because we're suspended, we can't appeal those decisions." Stunning. So he's complaining that TikTok has basically deplatformed him. So he's off TikTok now. He can't even use it to talk about his election stuff. And what is he saying in those election pieces anyway? Like, what's he talking about on the general? So yesterday on Twitter, he had a big warning that potentially Fetterman could lose against Oz, and that Warnock, the Georgia race, he could lose against the football player Herschel Walker. And then he had one other example of someone who might lose, who was supposed to win, but could lose, and it's going to be bad. So it was 3 people in a row. And his conclusion was the Democrats were likely to lose the House and Senate. And so he's sort of out there advocating for this to not happen. And I think we can be pretty clear that, he's on one side. So what I want to do today is just by showing his how mobile Mr. Pakman is and how fluid he is on the election issue, that if he lets this one piece fall, he's kind of cornered. And in being cornered, he's only got one path out, just like the video game character. So as you know, the video game character Pac-Man, because we live in a simulation. It's basically just a huge video game, right? So Pac-Man is coming to the conclusion with this dead end at the elections that any other way he goes to sort of make sense of the world around him, I think, is just going to lead to trouble. And we're going to show that today. And that there is really only one way out for Mr. Pakman. He's got to get, if you remember the game Pac-Man, he's got to get the sort of magic food, and the magic food allows him to turn the tables and eat the ghosts that would otherwise eat him. If you're too young to know how Pac-Man works, that's what it is. You can eat these little guys. You got to eat all these little guys before the ghost hits you. But sometimes there are these magic berries that allow you to actually go eat the ghosts, right? So the first one we have here is from the elections, right? So Pakman going on about this stuff. Meanwhile, we've got Glenn Greenwald mentioning all the crazy stuff that's been going on in our election as well. He keeps reminding us that basically anyone who disagrees with the Democrat Party and questions war, for example, Well, they're obviously a Russian agent. And you've got example after example here. He brought them up yesterday, Glenn Greenwald did, but here you go again. There was a reporter yesterday, or 2 days ago, who interviewed, an NBC reporter who interviewed the Pennsylvania candidate for Senate against Dr. Mehmet Oz, the Democrat candidate named Fetterman. And Fetterman has had a stroke and he's got real trouble speaking, right? And so what ended up happening, there was kind of a civil war yesterday within Democrat media circles, within the echo chamber itself, because one journalist came out and said, look, he's incapable of having a conversation. He had to use a machine which fed him information, and he was able to read it off the printed pages and give answers. Also, which he read, which the machine spat out at him. And the NBC journalist said this was really weird. He's almost incapable of a conversation. Now, what I will say is Kara Swisher, who I've booked for a show before and who's sort of a tech journalist or something like that for the New York Times, said, I spoke with this fella as well, Fetterman, and it was nothing like that. He was capable of a conversation. So, Kara Swisher, not known to be a liar whatsoever, no reputation of being a liar, don't want to say she's lying. All I'm trying to point out is that the two parties disagreed, the NBC reporter, the New York Times reporter, and then you had a whole civil war within the Democrat Party about that. And you had things like this. On The View yesterday, you had people attacking the NBC journalist, Dasha Burns, saying it was inappropriate for her to admit that Fetterman is struggling. Maybe she's bad at small talk. Maybe it's her, Whoopi Goldberg chided. Sunny claimed that this journalist broke journalistic ethics and defends Fetterman, saying she too requires closed captions. So she's another host of the show saying, I need closed captions. What happened there wasn't exactly the same thing. He actually had kind of an AI interpreting the questions, and he was reading answers from this thing. It wasn't just a computer program that printed out closed captioning. It looked like it formulated answers for him. Now, I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think we need politicians to be so smart. I kind of like the image of a very feeble-minded politician. It's good, I think, for Bitcoin and for changing the way the world works and for changing our perception of them. Like, I really like that Biden is so full of cobwebs in the brain and basically can't string a sentence together. And Fetterman is also the same. It's kind of good, right, to have these people as an image, to have these people representing dollars in the US federal system. Federal system's the wrong way to put it. The US Federal Reserve and its relationship to the Federation itself. So, Glenn Greenwald brings up a really great point that for decades, examining the physical and mental health of politicians seeking high office is journalistically required. Of course, the public should know Fetterman post-stroke capabilities. Nobody disputes this. His Senate win is vital, and therefore questioning him is banned. And Glenn Greenwald goes on to remind us that right before the 2020 election, most of the US corporate media spread an absolute lie that Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation. And, we made this point yesterday, and Glenn Greenwald's been making this point regularly, that it's an old trick. Anyone who disagrees about our policy with Russia is immediately called a Russian agent, and it's been going on for years from both Democrats and Republicans. So this is not a partisan issue necessarily. In fact, it's a little strange seeing Democrats do it to this extent, whereas it usually was thought of as sort of a neocon right-wing thing to do. But, Glenn Greenwald's been making the argument for a long time now that neocons have jumped into the Democrat Party because they were ousted by Trump in the way he won the election and the sort of cohort that he brought to the party. But here's the funny thing even about Fetterman. Yesterday, just to give you a context of how absolutely bad it is and how people are probably running defense for him on CNN yesterday, they had, the doctor, the one that said he was afraid that Joe Rogan was going to beat him up on the show if he disagreed, Sanjay Gupta, he said like, oh, I was intimidated. He had to go on CNN. He admitted something about CNN's reporting, how it was garbage during COVID because he was on Joe Rogan and Rogan was pressing him. And then when he went back to CNN the next day, they were trying to get him to walk it back. And in the end, his excuse was, oh, I was worried that Joe Rogan was going to beat me up. So I had to just give him the answer he wanted. So Sanjay, this is the guy we're dealing with here. Sanjay is on CNN yesterday, and he's got like a model of a human brain, and he's showing the parts on Fetterman's brain that don't work. So he's like, this is where the language is, and it doesn't work. Like, well, pretty sure if you're gonna try and be effective at this job, the language part is probably the part you need. Probably, but I don't know. So just to show you the kind of extent that media is taking in order to massage the results and push what's going on. But it looks like a dead end, because polling, all that kind of stuff, everyone's talking about how the Democrats are the worst thing ever, that Biden is the worst president. Even Democrats are not happy. And it looks like anyway, barring any change, that we're going to have an election and things are going to change. So what's going to happen to Mr. Pakman if the election domino falls? Where does he go psychologically, right? Because here he is in this relationship trying to get everyone to see the world the way he sees it. And he probably believes it, right? He probably believes it. But cognitive dissonance is a hell of a thing. It's a hell of a thing. And it will force you to ignore everything else in order to make the world continue to fit in the box that you have created for it. But reality has a way of spilling over and forcing you. So in this way, it might be the only way out. So we talk about elections, we talk about the economy, we talk about all that trouble, but connected to it is the energy question. It's always connected to it right now anyway, because the petrodollar, energy resources have a lot to do with policy, with economic policy, because it's part of the cause of inflation, right? If energy costs go up, everything else can go up. And so we're in a world where we've got at once the Federal Reserve trying to have demand destruction, right, to weaken consumer demand, and you've got the oil companies, by not pumping, are creating supply shock. So you've got demand destruction and supply shock, and both of these things are not great for an economy and could lead to recession, which is being predicted by everyone. And some massive percentage of Americans, I think it's 89%, think that the economy is the number one issue. Only fentanyl gets anywhere near those numbers. So usually in those instances, parties that are in charge of or in power take responsibility for economic woe, and we'll see if it's delivered in the ballot box, but we're pretending right now that we'll get the result that we're predicting. So so that's going on. With energy, if you move over here, you've got a very unpopular senator from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, representing this party. With all the trouble in the world, she's decided to have an inquiry and figure out what's going on with Texas crypto mining and energy consumption. So her very strange accusation is that consumers, this is her tweet, consumers shouldn't have to subsidize crypto mining's profits and exorbitant energy use, which rivals that of entire nations. I'm working with Representative Al Green to get, I don't know who Al Green is, just a congressman, I guess, to get answers about the risks crypto mining poses to the climate, grid, and energy bills. So the risks it poses. Is she going to do any work on the advantages it poses? Is she going to look at when I was in Texas this past June and temperatures were 105 degrees before the humidity, that we didn't even have one brownout, not even close? The reason? While I was there visiting the miners, they decided to not mine and give over the excess capacity to the grid, therefore meaning there was no need for any brownouts. A similar pattern repeated itself in the winter when an ice storm approached Texas, which is an excellent contrast to a 2021 ice storm that actually crippled Texas. So an ice storm crippled Texas in January, February 2021, just before the Chinese ban on Bitcoin miners in China, where all the rigs ended up moving and a huge amount of them got plugged in Texas. So the capacity of Bitcoin mining went through the roof when China banned it in 2021. So take that ice storm in 2021, which led to total blackouts around Texas because it tore infrastructure apart, to a very similar storm that rolled through there in 2022 after the Bitcoin migration of miners. And the Bitcoin miners were able to help the overall grid extend capacity, increase capacity. And because capacity was increased, they did the same thing they did this summer when I was there. They just said, hey, we got it. Take it. We're not going to mine. We'll give you the capacity so you can run the engine hotter and therefore mitigate any downturn. So I wonder if Elizabeth Warren is going to look at that side of it. Grid stabilization, probably not. Probably not, because this is not really an exercise in economics. Because if she was that worried, she would just take a look at China, one of our major competitors. Yesterday, China, energy competitors, right? Just yesterday, China and an American company, Westinghouse, were able to add a new nuclear reactor to its fleet. I believe it is the fourth or fifth one of these that has gone online in China. And what it is a Gen 3 nuclear reactor. Now, forget about all, capacity, safer advancements, all that kind of stuff. The really interesting part of this device is that it is the nth model, which means they have created a system to mass produce these. Right? They've created a system now after building a few to mass produce them. There are 2 of these units that will come online in America shortly as well in the next couple of years. And the goal from here is to basically just start cranking them out, right? Just start cranking them out. So right away, when we start thinking of, elections are basically going to change the conditions a lot, right? They're going to change perception a lot. David Pakman is not going to be able to go on the same grift that he was on, complaining about Trump. And by the way, Trump got called for the January 6th subpoena. He got subpoenaed for January 6th. So Trump is actually going to have to come to Congress before the election for his testimony, which I can imagine is going to be a huge spectacle. And I think a risk for the Democrats, because you're bringing someone into the mix here who you can't really predict what he's going to do, right? He's so clever and so good at getting attention that one can imagine that people like Elizabeth Warren and all these folks, they're not really up to the task, right? They're jumping into the ring with the Muhammad Ali of perception and persuasion. And here's a guy who could just completely flip the entire narrative instantly almost. So we'll see how that goes for them. But if we put that into the context of the election, right? So energy and the election, there's one other really important piece, which was yesterday, the Saudis shared a letter which showed that Joe Biden was begging the Saudi control of OPEC Plus to continue pumping. For how long? For American people? For the economy? Was it for our well-being? What was it for? Well, it turns out he begged for them to delay the production grind, the production slowdown to after the midterms. So everything's political, right? And this was Saudi Arabia basically saying to Joe Biden, the Joe Biden administration, you guys are toast. Like, we don't even think we're going to be working with you in a few months anyway. So good luck. See you later. And the perception of this is it's wide now. It looks like the Americans, Biden in particular, was only interested in not having any bad economic news before the election. Right? He wants to just get past the midterms and then let people burn. That's fine. Like if the economy goes south, oil prices go up after the election, who cares? They've extended their power. So in the end, it's one of the policies that's put us in the most danger, right? America is in incredible danger and incredibly vulnerable because of these energy policies, because we're begging Saudi all to win an election. We're allowing all of this stuff to go on around us, Russia, Europe. At what point do these countries start saying, well, David Pakman, what were you doing in America? What were you doing making these videos focused on, oh, if Fetterman loses, if Warnock loses, all is lost, right? Is really the focus of what we need to get done in the world today, with all of the dark clouds gathering in Europe and all this stuff, is really the Senate election in Pennsylvania, in order to make sure that a guy who they have to put a brain model to show which parts of his brain aren't working, like that's the priority, right? We have to be so afraid of him not getting elected. So only in a really bad relationship would you allow for this kind of abuse to continue to yourself, to your audience, to your fans, to everyone, right? So we see it happening again and again. So we've got elections coming from Mr. Pakman. We've got energy issues coming from Mr. Pakman. Is he going to get blamed for the poverty that's coming to America if we don't get this stuff right? Maybe, maybe not. But nevertheless, it was a quid pro quo where the president said, I'm not going to give you weapons. Please delay any change to output of oil till after the elections, and therefore it'll be better for me. How likely does that look now? Well, it looks like a 0% chance, because what we've got is Saudi basically saying we're going to do something else. So how does that all tie into the economy? Well, you've got Jamie Dimon saying there's not going to be a soft landing. Right? He was on TV yesterday. He's doing the rounds, criticized everything about American energy policy. So basically threw the Dems under the bus on that one, and said the economy's not going to have a soft landing. He also mentioned he's got about $1.3 trillion, $1.3 trillion in cash, sitting on a pile of $1.3 trillion in cash to fight whatever troubles the economy has. Right? He thinks it's not going to be a soft landing, but he's not too worried. He's at $1.3 trillion in order to soften the landing. So I don't think he's got any of that money earmarked for David Pakman. So the economy itself, if it falters because of this stuff, we're in big trouble. And even if you look at I saw an amazing chart in the Financial Times, usually full of fake news, but they had a really great chart 2 days ago that said that Bitcoin is less volatile now than UK pension funds and the gilts that we've been talking about on the show that have required all kinds of emergency interventions and that kind of stuff. So already we see that Bitcoiners have made a more accurate prediction about the future. How many Bitcoiners said for years, wait until you see, one day they're going to wonder why Bitcoin isn't as volatile as pension funds and all this other stuff. And we're there. We're actually there. It's happening today. It's been for 2 weeks now that UK pension funds far more volatile than Bitcoin. Far more. And everyone's seeing it that way, which is absolutely remarkable. And, we've got related to energy and the environment, we've got even Greta, again, coming out for nuclear, and really underlining that the solutions are there, And we've got David Pakman, who's just not seeing them. He continues to reiterate that the most important thing we can do, again, is get a guy who had a stroke, who we're not allowed to question his physical fitness, into office. Now, again, I don't have a problem with a semi-handicap or even a full handicap person being in office. Really, I don't, right? They get whipped on votes anyway. How hard is it to vote exactly like the person next to you and next to you? It's not hard. So a cat can do it, a dog can do it, a robot can do it, as long as they know how to follow, a binary order, yay or nay, they're good, right? They don't have to make speeches and all that stuff. It's not necessary. So you've got that going on. Now, if you put all of this together, we've got Macron warning with the conditions we've seen in energy, with economic downturns, with all of these stresses. Macron yesterday, the president of France, said, we don't want a world war. And of course, all of the folks from David Pakman's camp, not David Pakman, right? Let's not make David Pakman, let's not put words into his mouth and create fake news, right? He didn't say any of those things. David Pakman didn't say any of those things. But the world he's promoting came out and attacked Macron quickly. Vindman, who we've talked about a bunch, right? He was the agent who listened in on the phone call, the perfect phone call that Trump had with Zelensky. If you remember, he had a conversation with Zelensky. And Vindman was the star witness in that impeachment trial just before COVID. He was the guy who, when the bridge blew up just a few days ago, said, I've been dreaming about this moment. And he says to Macron, nonsense. So Macron says, we do not want a world war. Vindman says, nonsense. Neither did Ukraine. Having failed to do more to deter Russian aggression, may I suggest you at least uncuff/enable Ukraine to win and prevent a long war that has every likelihood of spilling over. Inaction is often a more dangerous course of action. He might be right. But do any of these people even have any kind of sue for peace on their mind? Now, I get why you wouldn't sue for peace. They're winning. Right? You don't sue for peace when you're winning, unless the person losing is in a corner and has nuclear bombs. That's probably the only time you should think of a peaceful solution, and they're not doing it. David Sachs picked up on that and said, the latest pro-Ukrainian position is that if you don't want World War III, like Emmanuel Macron and Elon Musk, then you are pro-Russian. It is time to say no to these fanatics. So we had other folks doing the exact same thing. And it's been going on for a while, right? It's not the first time this has happened. As Glenn Greenwald mentioned, this has been something that's been common over the years, that folks have been talking about, accusing folks who disagree with military policy that they are Russian agents and the rest of it. So how can we save David Pakman, right? How can we save David Pakman? Well, David here, he can't continue to support these elections and keep his brain functional, because the amount of things you're going to have to shut off, the amount of things you're going to have to ignore, is going to create a type of cognitive dissonance that will kill you, right? It's really bad. Now, the only way out is for him to understand that energy can be taken away from a lot of these governments and policymakers and all the rest of the companies themselves who are creating the energy, who are finding the energy, who are producing it, who are selling it. Just like what Elizabeth Warren is kind of trying to look into to condemn, right? It's happening in real life, but it's happening in a very positive way. So if you take that orange pill and you start realizing that actually we can solve our energy problems and our environmental problems at the same time, right? And if you solve energy problems and you solve the environment problems, well, the economy is not going to be far away, right? Economy, we talk about economics a lot on this show. In the end, we can make it super simple, right? You could boil economics down to the simplest criteria. And I can see it because I'm from Quebec, and it's this: your economy is just directly tied to your energy policies, capacity, system, right? So Quebec is a lot like Texas. It's just rich. It's just rich. It just has so much energy. And therefore, they can almost do, and they're different than Texans. I often compare Quebecers to Texans. I think they're really similar. It's the two sub-federal states in North America where the state flag is more popular than the federal flag, where the people themselves think of themselves as a separate country. And the wealth of energy has a lot to do with the similarities and all that. Now, outwardly, they created different societies. Oh, you can even see an even more interesting comparison. So Austin, Texas, being a liberal capital of a conservative state, flip it in Quebec. Quebec City is a conservative city, the capital, in a liberal state. The main difference between Quebecers and Texans is really their religious ties that went into their operating systems, I guess. Quebecers are absolutely not super religious any longer at all, but the Catholic operating system is still there. And so the main difference I would see between Quebec and Texas is small government, big government. Big government being extension of the old, all their, like I went to a Quebec university. These were all religious schools at one point and didn't really focus on English style academics, Anglo-Saxon style academics. They were all clergy schools before. The Jesuits had a large role to play in that whole system. It's a good education system, and it morphed over the time to be more like the Western, or more like the American and British system. So now it's almost identical. But previous, when it was still a very religious state, it was all religious indoctrination and religious education, and it served them quite well for most of their history. So what we got here is basically a fella who, has just drunk too much of the Kool-Aid and is probably trapped by some of these ideas. And if I was to suggest the one way out for him, it is this energy policy where, basically, if he's so in the bag for the Democrats, if he's so there to pump every single Democrat candidate, then the best plan for him is to look at one of the worst candidates and members out there, Elizabeth Warren, and say, well, if I'm going to criticize anyone, because he can't criticize, he's out there criticizing just Republicans all the time, right? if he's going to criticize someone on his own team, he's got Elizabeth Warren right in front of him. And if she doesn't make the right choice and does turn this into a star chamber where they just condemn Bitcoin and mining and it's a disaster and all that stuff, and Texas should stop and blah, 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 then you know, at least you'll have a little more interesting stuff to do. And then finally, you know, David Pakman is from Argentina, if you didn't know that. He's actually born in Buenos Aires. So I'm sure he's got some families that can tell him, and friends and everything, that can tell him about all the trouble with the economy and what can happen there. So that's David Pakman. Let's see what we got for chats here. Morning, team. Yeah, so Justin says, incredible to see the hash rate increase since the China exodus. Yeah, it's one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my life, really. To watch that much hardware and that much, like, it was almost like a military style logistics operation done volunteer, done decentralized, with people who pivoted real quick and were able to move all that stuff over. So good for them, you know, good for them. All right, team, I got a call. I always have a call on Friday, so Fridays are a little shorter. Did I miss anything today? Did I miss any of my stories? Let me have a look here. We got the Saudi thing. We got that. I think that's everything. Yeah, and Justin says, and especially given how most people in the mining states couldn't predict it either. Yeah, I mean, if you remember, it looked hopeless for a couple of days, and no one knew what to do. And I was getting calls all over the place from folks saying, do you know where they can plug in Quebec and anywhere? And I said, Quebec has kind of banned it more capacity. And so it wasn't going to be open there. And then we had the troubles in New York and everything else. So I still don't quite understand why Canada can't figure it out and do more. They can't get their electricity or their energy out of the country anyway. So we're waiting for them to figure it out. And indeed, happy Friday, Justin. Happy Friday. We're happy to be on a Friday. All right, team. Ciao.